My name is Lucy Collins. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked in roles that required patience more than visibility. I've been the person people rely on when something needs to be done carefully, quietly, and without mistakes. The one who stays late without being asked. The one who fixes what's broken before anyone notices it was ever broken at all. If you asked the people around me back then how they'd describe me, they'd probably say I was dependable, easy to work with, low maintenance, maybe even forgettable. Not because I lacked ability, but because I never demanded attention for it. I didn't interrupt meetings. I didn't promote myself loudly. I didn't make scenes. I believed very sincerely that consistency would speak for itself. This story isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. No villains twirling mustaches, no explosive confrontations. It's about something quieter, and in many ways more common. It's about what happens when loyalty is rewarded with more work and less respect. When the harder you work, the smaller you become in the eyes of the people benefiting from your effort. For a long time, I thought that was just how adulthood worked. You prove yourself, you carry more weight, you stay grateful for having a seat at the table, even if no one asks for your opinion once you're there. I told myself that being overlooked was temporary, that recognition was just around the corner, that silence was maturity. This isn't a revenge story. There's no moment where I raise my voice or embarrass anyone. There's no public downfall. What happened instead was a slow internal shift, a recalibration of how I saw myself, and how I allowed others to define my value. The change wasn't loud. Most people didn't even notice it happening. What you'll hear is an honest account of how I became invisible by being reliable, how I learned to observe instead of explain, and how quiet decisions, made without drama, can permanently change the balance of power in a room. Not through aggression, not through manipulation, but through clarity. I'm telling this story because I know how easy it is to confuse being needed with being respected, and how dangerous it can be to think that endurance is the same thing as worth. Before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently and without judgment. Have you ever felt like the more you gave, the less you were seen? To understand what happened later, you have to understand who I was to them before anything changed. I wasn't invisible in the literal sense. People knew my name. They greeted me in the hallways. They trusted me with things that mattered. But I existed in a narrow space, useful, contained, predictable. I was the person you looped in when something was complicated and time-sensitive, but not the person you invited when decisions were being made about the future. At work, my role sounded important on paper. Operations coordinator, it implied oversight, structure, and influence. In reality, it meant I was the connective tissue. I absorbed problems before they spread. I remembered details others forgot. I smoothed conflicts quietly, so leadership never had to see the friction underneath. When something worked seamlessly, it was assumed that's just how things were supposed to go. People came to me with phrases like, "Lucy will handle it," "She's good with this kind of thing," "Just give it to Lucy, she won't make a fuss." That last part mattered more than I realized. I didn't make a fuss. I rarely said no. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed cooperation was a form of professionalism. I thought being adaptable showed intelligence. I told myself I was playing the long game, even though no one had actually promised there was a game being played. In meetings, I spoke when asked. I presented facts, not opinions. When someone else repeated an idea I'd shared privately earlier and it landed better coming from them, I didn't correct the record. I assumed the work would eventually trace back to me. That credit, like water, would find its level. Outside observers would probably say I was respected. Internally, though, I was being categorized. I could feel it in small ways. Tasks slid toward me that others avoided. Responsibilities expanded without titles changing. When something urgent came up late on a Friday, eyes would drift, not maliciously, just instinctively, in my direction. Lucy can stay. Lucy doesn't mind. Lucy understands. And I did understand. I understood everyone else's pressures, their deadlines, their ambitions, their stress. I rarely asked who understood me. What's important here is that I wasn't unhappy. Not in a dramatic way. There was no daily dread, no burning resentment. I took pride in being reliable. There's a quiet satisfaction in being the person things don't fall apart around. I liked knowing I was capable, needed. But over time, something subtle happened. The harder I worked, the smaller I became. Not smaller in effort, smaller in presence. My value was measured less by judgment and more by endurance. I was no longer seen as someone who could lead, only someone who could carry. The work expanded horizontally, never vertically. More weight, same position. And because I carried it without complaint, the carrying became invisible. No one sat me down and said, "We don't respect you." That's not how these things happen. Respect erodes through assumption, through convenience, through the quiet decision that someone else will always pick up what's left behind. I was the safe option, the non-threatening one, the person who wouldn't push back and force discomfort into the room. That made me valuable, but only in one direction. Looking back now, I can see how clearly defined my role had become to them. I just couldn't see it yet from the inside. When you're inside a system that rewards silence with stability, it's easy to mistake stillness for security. I believed I was building something. What I was really doing was shrinking to fit the shape others found most useful. And at the time, I would have told you I was fine with that. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. That's what made it dangerous. It happened during a routine project review, one of those meetings that felt more procedural than meaningful. We were gathered around the long table, laptops half open, coffee cooling beside us. I had spent the previous week untangling a scheduling issue that had stalled two departments. It wasn't flashy work, but it mattered. Without it, deadlines would slip, and no one wanted to explain that upward. When the discussion reached that section, my manager summarized the resolution. Not incorrectly, just without me. He said we had decided on a new process. We had realigned priorities. We had fixed the bottleneck. I waited for my name to appear somewhere in that explanation. It didn't. No one looked at me. No one corrected the narrative. The meeting moved on. On the surface, it was nothing. People paraphrase all the time. Credit gets blurred in group settings. I told myself that immediately. I even nodded along, taking notes like I always did. But something inside me paused, the way your body pauses when it registers a minor injury before the pain arrives. Later that afternoon, a colleague stopped by my desk and said, "Good job on that scheduling mess. I'm glad they finally sorted it." I smiled, thanked her, let it pass. That was the first small cut. It wasn't about recognition in a shallow sense. I didn't need applause. What unsettled me was how easily my contribution had been absorbed into the background, as if my effort was assumed rather than acknowledged, as if the work existed independently of the person who did it. I replayed the meeting in my head that evening, not obsessively, but carefully, looking for signs I'd misread it. Maybe it truly didn't matter. Maybe this was just how collaborative environments worked. I reminded myself that my manager trusted me, that I was included in important conversations, that this one omission didn't erase years of reliability. Still, I wrote it down, not in an emotional way, just a line in my notebook. Date, meeting, observation. At the time, I didn't know why I did that. I wasn't planning anything. I wasn't angry. It felt more like documenting a weather change than preparing for a storm. In the weeks that followed, similar moments appeared, small enough that no one else reacted. A task was reassigned without explanation. A decision was made using information I had provided, discussed as though it had come from nowhere. Praise given to a team for stepping up, while the person who had quietly held the structure together remained unnamed. Each time I noticed, each time I said nothing. Part of me believed that pointing it out would make me look insecure, or petty, or ungrateful. I had built my professional identity on being steady and unbothered. I didn't want to jeopardize that over what could be interpreted as ego. So I absorbed it, rationalized it, normalized it. Everyone else seemed comfortable with the version of events being presented. Why disrupt that harmony? Why be the only one insisting on precision when the outcome was already positive? But there was a cost to staying quiet that I couldn't articulate yet. The first small cut didn't hurt because it was deep. It hurt because it changed the way I paid attention. Once you notice the absence of your name, you start noticing where else it goes missing. Once you see how easily your effort blends into we, you realize how replaceable the individual can become when they never assert their identity. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't demand credit. I kept working the same way I always had, carefully, thoroughly, without drama. But something had shifted, not in how they treated me, in how I observe them. Once you notice something, it becomes easier to see it everywhere. The moments didn't escalate, they multiplied, quietly, predictably. Each one was small enough to dismiss on its own, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer pretend was accidental. Meetings became summaries of work I recognized, but no longer owned. Decisions were announced that leaned heavily on groundwork I had laid, framed as collective insight or managerial direction. When timelines tightened, expectations landed on my desk without conversation, as if my capacity was an infinite resource that didn't require consent. And I adapted. That's the part I'm not proud of, but it's the truth. I adjusted my expectations downward instead of adjusting my boundaries upward. I told myself I was being practical, mature, strategic. I said things like, "This isn't personal," or "They're under pressure too," or the most dangerous one, "It's easier this way." I became skilled at explaining away my own discomfort. If a meeting ended without my input, I told myself my silence was efficiency. If my workload increased without acknowledgement, I reframed it as trust. If someone spoke over me, I assumed they were just eager, not dismissive. I had a rationale ready for every erosion, and I delivered those explanations to myself with convincing calm. Outwardly, nothing changed. I was still polite, still responsive, still dependable. People continued to describe me as solid and low friction. I received no negative feedback because, from their perspective, there was no problem to address. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive with a warning. It settles in through repetition, through your own cooperation with what feels uncomfortable but survivable. I didn't want to be seen as difficult. I'd watched what happened to people who pushed back too hard, too early. They were labeled emotional, political, not a team player. I told myself I was choosing stability over noise, that I was protecting my position. What I didn't see yet was that my position wasn't actually moving. I was learning to accept a version of myself that required less space. I remember one particular afternoon when a junior colleague asked me how I managed to handle so much without complaining. She said it like a compliment, and I smiled, because that's what was expected. But something in her tone lingered, not admiration, relief. Relief that someone else would carry the weight without shifting it back into the system. That's when it struck me. My silence wasn't neutral, it was functional. It made things easier for everyone else. And because it worked, it was reinforced. The more I absorbed, the more was given. The more reliable I proved myself to be, the less visible I became as an individual. I was no longer a person with limits. I was a solution with a face. I didn't resent my colleagues. That's important. Most of them weren't intentionally dismissive. They were responding to the structure that had formed around me, a structure I had helped build by never challenging it. Still, there were moments, usually late in the day, when I felt something tightening, not anger, not sadness, a kind of compression, like I was folding inward to stay acceptable. I'd go home and replay conversations, not to argue them differently, but to understand why I hadn't spoken. And the answer was always the same, because it felt safer not to. Safer to be needed than to be seen as demanding. Safer to be indispensable than to be visible and vulnerable. Safer to accept the role than to risk being recast. So I stayed quiet. And in doing so, I trained everyone, including myself, to expect less of my presence and more of my output. Disrespect doesn't always look like hostility. Sometimes it looks like comfort, like assumption, like the ease with which people step into the space you vacated by not insisting it was yours. By the time I realized I was normalizing it, the behavior felt familiar enough to pass for routine. And routines are hard to break, especially when they reward you with the illusion of peace. But peace built on erasure is fragile. I just didn't know yet how fragile it really was. It didn't happen all at once. No one gathered in a room and decided who I would be. Roles like mine emerge quietly, shaped by repetition and unspoken agreement. By the time I recognized it, the role had already solidified. I was the reliable one, not the visionary, not the decision maker, not the person whose absence would stall progress because of authority, but the one whose absence would cause everything to quietly unravel behind the scenes. I was infrastructure. Necessary, unnoticed, taken for granted. When new projects were announced, I wasn't asked if I had capacity. I was informed. My involvement was assumed, like electricity or running water. People spoke around me instead of to me, confident I'd fill in the gaps without needing direction. And I did, because I knew how, because I cared, because I'd convinced myself that excellence didn't need an audience. But there was a difference between humility and erasure, and I was crossing it daily. I started to notice how people adjusted their behavior around me. Not in hostility, quite the opposite. They relaxed. Deadlines were looser when they knew I was involved. Planning became sloppier because someone else would catch the inconsistencies. I had become the margin of error. That should have alarmed me sooner than it did. The role I was assigned required me to be endlessly patient, endlessly competent, and emotionally neutral. Any deviation from that would have felt like a breach of contract, one I had never signed but was expected to honor. When I offered an opinion that went beyond logistics, something strategic, something forward-looking, it was acknowledged politely, then set aside. "Let's keep this simple," someone would say. Or, "That's interesting, but maybe not necessary right now." The message was clear. My value lay in execution, not direction. And I accepted that, because pushing against it felt like stepping out of character. There's a subtle pressure that comes with being seen as dependable. You're not allowed to be tired, or uncertain, or ambitious in ways that disrupt the flow. Your strength becomes a constraint. You're praised for being steady, which is another way of saying you're expected to stay where you are. I remember a conversation with a manager who said, "We really rely on you, Lucy. You're the glue." He meant it kindly. I thanked him. But later I realized glue doesn't get to choose where things go. It just holds them together. That's when the truth surfaced, quietly but clearly. I wasn't being prepared for growth. I was being positioned for containment. The system worked because I made it work. And systems don't reward the parts that prevent collapse. They just assume they'll keep functioning. Once I saw the role, I couldn't unsee it. Every interaction confirmed it. Every unspoken expectation reinforced it. I was the person others leaned on so they could stretch upward, outward, elsewhere. And still I didn't confront anyone. Not because I didn't care, but because I was starting to understand something more important. Reacting emotionally would only strengthen the role. It would make me seem unstable in contrast to the calm, compliant version they preferred. So I observed. I listened more than I spoke. I noted who made decisions, who took credit, who avoided risk, and who depended on my silence to maintain their position. I stopped assuming benevolence and started recognizing structure. The role I was assigned wasn't malicious, it was efficient. And efficiency, once established, resists change. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. Because once you understand the role you're playing, you can decide whether to keep performing it or exit the stage entirely. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I was done pretending I didn't know. The shift didn't happen during a meeting, or after a sharp comment, or because someone finally crossed an obvious line. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, in a moment so small it would have been invisible to anyone else. I was alone in the office earlier than usual, reviewing a report that had been passed to me for a quick check. It wasn't quick. It was incomplete, inconsistently sourced, and quietly dependent on assumptions I knew would unravel under scrutiny. Fixing it would take hours. Explaining why it needed fixing would take even longer. I stared at the screen, hands still on the keyboard, and felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Resistance. Not anger, not frustration, just a clear, calm refusal forming inside me. For the first time, I didn't automatically move to repair what wasn't mine to fix. I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What happens if I don't? The answer wasn't catastrophic. No one would be harmed. The company wouldn't collapse. Someone else would have to slow down, think, maybe even take responsibility. The realization was unsettling, not because of the consequences, but because of how manageable they were. I had built my identity around preventing discomfort, and in doing so, I had exaggerated its cost. I fixed the report anyway, but something had changed in how I did it. I documented every correction, flagged every assumption, tracked every dependency, not defensively, methodically, as if I were no longer just participating but recording. That afternoon, there was a brief exchange in the hallway. A colleague joked lightly about how I always saved the day. I smiled, out of habit, but internally the phrase landed differently. Saving the day meant someone else got to keep wasting it. I went home that evening and didn't replay conversations. I didn't justify anyone's behavior. I didn't blame myself. I just sat with the recognition that the system worked because I kept it frictionless. And that frictionlessness had a cost I was paying alone. That was the shift. Not outward, inward. I stopped asking how to be more patient and started asking how things functioned without me. I began noticing what information flowed through me, what processes depended on my intervention, and how often my judgment was used without my presence. There was no confrontation, no declaration, no decision to leave or stay, just a quiet recalibration of attention. I realized I had leverage I'd never acknowledged. Not positional power, but informational gravity. I knew how things actually worked, not how they were presented. I understood the gaps, the shortcuts, the unspoken dependencies, and I had been donating that understanding freely. That day I didn't withdraw it, but I stopped giving it automatically. The hardest part was resisting the urge to explain myself, to preemptively justify why I might slow down or ask questions. I let silence exist where it normally wouldn't, let others fill it. Nothing dramatic happened, no one panicked, no alarms went off. But I noticed something subtle. When I didn't immediately respond, people adjusted. They waited. They reconsidered their phrasing. They clarified. The work didn't collapse, it redistributed. That was the moment I understood that silence, used deliberately, was not absence. It was presence withheld. And withholding, when done calmly, changes the shape of a room. I went to bed that night with an unfamiliar feeling. Not relief, not excitement, but steadiness. As if I'd finally stopped leaning forward to hold something up that was supposed to stand on its own. The shift wasn't about asserting myself. It was about stepping back far enough to see clearly. From that day on, I was still quiet. But it was no longer automatic. After that Tuesday, nothing on the surface changed. I showed up on time. I answered emails. I completed my responsibilities. If someone had asked, I would have said everything was normal. And it would have been true. The difference was internal. Silence was no longer my default setting. It was a decision. I stopped filling gaps immediately. When someone asked a vague question, I asked for clarification instead of intuiting their intent. When tasks were dropped into my lap without context, I paused long enough for the weight of that assumption to be felt. I didn't refuse. I didn't confront. I simply allowed space to exist where I used to rush in. At first, people barely noticed. They were used to my reliability, not my speed. A slight delay didn't register as resistance. It registered as availability later than expected. Then the interpretation started. I could feel it in the tone of the messages, the polite follow-ups, the just checking in notes that arrived sooner than necessary. In meetings, my silence was filled by others more quickly, as if to compensate. They mistook my quiet for disengagement, or worse, compliance. Without realizing it, they assumed I was still absorbing everything, still smoothing edges behind the scenes. The structure remained intact because they believed I was holding it up, even as I loosened my grip. That assumption was my advantage. I listened carefully. I noted which processes slowed when I didn't intervene and which continued unaffected. I observed who noticed the delay and who didn't, who adapted and who grew uncomfortable. No one accused me of anything. There was no open friction. Silence is difficult to challenge because it doesn't declare itself. It leaves no clear target. And because I wasn't withdrawing effort, only precision, there was nothing obvious to criticize. In one meeting, a manager asked if everything was okay. I said yes, because it was. I didn't elaborate. The question hung in the air longer than my answer, and I let it. People often interpret silence as weakness because they're used to equating volume with strength. They assume that if you're not asserting yourself, you must be waiting for permission. What they didn't see was that I was gathering information. I was learning where my involvement was essential and where it was merely convenient. I was mapping dependencies, understanding which outcomes relied on my judgment and which only needed my labor. And I was careful not to change too much at once. Quiet dominance isn't about sudden withdrawal. It's about consistency with intention. I continued delivering quality work, but only within the scope that was explicitly defined. I stopped protecting others from the consequences of their own oversights. When something was unclear, I let it remain unclear long enough to require resolution. When expectations were unspoken, I waited for them to be spoken aloud. This unsettled people more than open defiance ever could, because it forced them to confront the structure they had grown comfortable leaning on. Still, no one saw it as a strategy. They saw it as passivity. As for me, staying in my lane, as Lucy being Lucy. And that misinterpretation gave me room to observe without interference. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting an exit. I was simply allowing reality to surface without my constant intervention. Silence, I learned, is only empty when you have nothing to protect. Mine was full of intent. What they never noticed was how much I saw when I stopped speaking. When you're quiet by nature, people assume you're not tracking the room. They speak freely around you. They repeat themselves. They contradict earlier statements without realizing it. Silence creates a false sense of safety for those who are used to dominating the narrative. I listened, not passively, actively. I started documenting patterns, not out of resentment, but out of clarity. I noted where decisions originated and how they were later reframed. I tracked which priorities shifted depending on who was present. I observed how often urgency was manufactured to justify poor planning, and how often my past interventions had disguised that fact. I wasn't collecting evidence in a legal sense. I was collecting understanding. Every organization runs on two systems, the one written down and the one everyone actually uses. I had always operated in the second. Now I was mapping it. I learned who needed me, and more importantly, why. Some needed my memory, my ability to recall how things had been handled before, what had failed, what had quietly succeeded. Others needed my discretion. A few relied on my judgment without wanting to acknowledge it, because acknowledgement would require accountability. I also noticed something else. No one was checking whether I was okay with any of it. My workload had become institutionalized, not assigned, assumed, and assumptions are fragile once they're exposed. I began organizing my notes, process flows, decision histories, dependencies that lived only in my head. I didn't hoard information. I structured it, cleanly, neutrally, as if I were preparing it to stand on its own. Positioning, I learned, isn't about climbing. It's about making yourself legible on your own terms. I also paid attention to how others positioned themselves, who spoke confidently without substance, who deferred upward, who avoided documentation, who relied on ambiguity to maintain control. There was no rush. I wasn't preparing for a reveal. I was preparing for inevitability. The more I stepped back, the more visible the gaps became, not to me, but to the system. Projects slowed slightly. Questions circled longer. People double-checked things they used to assume were handled. And still no one connected it to me. They never noticed the quiet person until the quiet stops compensating. In one instance, a recurring issue surfaced that I had resolved multiple times in the past without anyone realizing it had even been an issue. This time, I let the discussion unfold. I watched as three people debated solutions I knew wouldn't work. I waited. Eventually, someone asked me what I thought. I gave a precise answer, short, factual, enough to redirect the outcome without explaining the history behind it. The room relaxed, the issue dissolved, and just like that, the moment passed. They didn't ask how I knew. They didn't ask how many times this had happened before. They didn't ask what it meant that I could see it so quickly. They assumed I'd always be there to do that. That assumption was the leverage. I wasn't becoming louder. I wasn't asserting dominance overtly. I was becoming indispensable in a way that didn't rely on visibility but on understanding. And I was making sure that understanding was no longer invisible to me. There's a difference between being taken for granted and being underestimated. Being taken for granted makes you exhausted. Being underestimated gives you time. Time to prepare, time to decide, time to choose. By the end of that phase, I knew exactly how much of the system rested on my silent participation. I knew which threads, if released, wouldn't cause chaos, but would reveal truth. I still hadn't decided what to do with that knowledge, but I was done pretending I didn't have it. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no moment where I leaned back and thought, so this is it. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does, when enough pieces settle into place that denial is no longer available. I was reviewing a long-running workflow that crossed 3 departments. It had evolved over the years, adjusted informally, patched where it broke. On paper, it looked collaborative. In practice, it worked because I had become its memory. No one had asked me to be that. It had just happened. As I traced the process end to end, something became unmistakable. There was no redundancy for what I did. No documentation was captured of the judgment calls. No one else understood why certain steps existed or what would happen if they were removed. If I stopped intervening, not dramatically, just fully, the system wouldn't explode. It would stall. Deadlines would slip quietly. Decisions would be revisited. Confidence would erode not because of incompetence, but because the invisible glue was gone. That was the reveal. Not that I was powerful, but that I was central. And centrality, when unacknowledged, is a form of leverage people hand you without realizing it. I didn't feel triumphant, I felt sober. Because leverage isn't something you use lightly. It's something you hold, knowing that once it's visible, it changes how people relate to you. I understood then why I'd avoided seeing it before. Seeing it meant responsibility. I tested nothing. I pulled no threads. I simply stopped cushioning outcomes. I let processes reflect their true shape without my constant adjustments. And the system began to show strain, not immediately, gradually. Small inefficiencies became discussion points. Questions came back with more urgency. Meetings ran longer. People circled problems instead of resolving them cleanly. Still, no one said my name. They talked about process issues, about unexpected complexity, about how things had become harder to manage lately. I listened. What struck me most wasn't their confusion. It was their assumption that the solution would emerge the same way it always had, quietly, without acknowledgement, from the same place. From me. That's when I understood the final piece. My leverage wasn't about withholding effort. It was about the visibility of dependency. As long as I remained silent and reliable, the dependency stayed hidden. The moment I allowed reality to surface, it became undeniable, but not yet traceable. That was the balance point. I didn't tell anyone what I'd realized. I didn't adjust my tone or posture. I continued working calmly, professionally, within clearly defined boundaries. I made sure my contributions were documented, my inputs explicit, my scope visible. Not loudly, clearly. Clarity is threatening to systems built on assumptions. The private reveal wasn't that I could disrupt things. It was that I could choose not to stabilize them without consent. And that choice, once recognized, couldn't be unseen. There was no celebration, no sense of winning, just a quiet understanding that the dynamic had already changed, whether anyone else knew it yet or not. I went home that night and closed my notebook with a feeling I hadn't had in years. Grounded. Because power, real power, doesn't announce itself. It waits. Once you see the truth of a situation, you don't get to unknow it. The reveal forced a decision, even if I wasn't ready to name it yet. I stood at a quiet intersection with several possible paths, all of them uncomfortable in different ways. I could continue as I was, aware now, but unchanged. That would mean living with the knowledge that my effort was propping up a structure that didn't see me, let alone protect me. It would be the safest option externally and the most corrosive internally. I could confront it directly, ask for recognition, demand clarity, try to renegotiate my role through conversation. That path was tempting in theory, but I understood its limits. Confrontation requires the other side to be capable of hearing you. And this system wasn't built to listen. It was built to absorb. Or I could do something quieter, something that didn't rely on permission or emotional validation. I spent weeks not deciding. Not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be precise. Rushed decisions are loud, precise ones are permanent. During that time, I paid close attention to my own reactions, not just to others, but to myself. I noticed how tired I felt after meetings where nothing was resolved, how alert I felt when I worked within clear boundaries, how my body responded to being assumed versus being asked. That information mattered. One afternoon, I was asked casually to take on another responsibility temporarily. No timeline, no trade-off, just an expectation wrapped in politeness. I heard myself say calmly, "I'll need to think about how that fits with my current scope." The room went quiet for half a second. Nothing dramatic followed. The conversation moved on. But in that pause, I felt the weight of the choice I was making, not just in words, but in direction. I realized then that the irreversible decision wasn't about leaving or staying. It was about no longer allowing my identity to be defined by what I absorbed. I chose alignment over approval. That meant accepting uncertainty. It meant letting others feel discomfort, which I used to intercept. It meant allowing outcomes to reflect reality instead of smoothing them into something more palatable. It also meant that whatever came next would change how people saw me, or whether they saw me at all. I wasn't angry about that. I was ready. The decision once made didn't feel bold. It felt inevitable, like stepping off a moving walkway and realizing you'd been carried further than you meant to go. From that point on, I stopped negotiating with myself. I worked transparently. I documented everything. I defined boundaries clearly and enforced them without apology. I didn't announce the change. I lived it. And that's when things began to shift. Not all at once, but unmistakably. Because systems can tolerate quiet endurance forever, they cannot tolerate quiet autonomy. Once the decision was made, the work became strangely calm. There was no urgency to explain myself, no need to justify each boundary as it appeared. I understood now that clarity didn't require consensus. It required consistency. So I moved in silence. Not secrecy, silence. I began by tightening my scope, not shrinking it, not expanding it, defining it. Tasks that belonged to me were handled with the same precision as always. Tasks that drifted toward me without ownership were returned gently, often with a simple question attached. Who's responsible for this? Can you clarify the priority? What does success look like here? Questions like that don't sound rebellious. They sound reasonable. And they force a structure where there used to be an assumption. I documented decisions in writing, not as protection, but as alignment. I summarized meetings, confirmed next steps, made implicit expectations explicit. Paper trails don't accuse, they illuminate. At the same time, I stopped compensating for missing information. If data wasn't provided, I didn't chase it. If timelines were unrealistic, I flagged them early and let them stand as written. The work slowed slightly, not enough to cause alarm, enough to change the texture. People noticed that things felt heavier, though they couldn't say why, like walking on a surface that used to be smooth and now has resistance. Still, no one connected it to me. They assumed complexity had increased. Those priorities were shifting, that the organization was in a phase, and I let them believe that. Because I wasn't withdrawing effort, I was withdrawing invisibility. Behind the scenes, I also began preparing for continuity without me. Not because I planned to disappear, but because independence is the strongest position you can hold. I organized files, clarified workflows, ensured nothing lived only in my head. If I were central, it would be by choice, not necessity. Ironically, that made my role more visible, not less. When everything is frictionless, no one asks why. When structure appears, people start noticing where it leads. There were moments when I felt the old reflex return, the urge to jump in, to smooth, to rescue, especially when I could see an issue forming before anyone else did. Letting it unfold felt uncomfortable, but I reminded myself, discomfort was not danger. I was still professional, still kind, still responsive, just no longer preemptive. The silence was doing its work. By the time the first real consequences surfaced, the shift was already embedded. There was no single action to point to, no incident to correct, only a system adjusting to the absence of a cushion it had never acknowledged. And that made what came next unavoidable. The first signs didn't look like failure, they looked confused. Projects that normally moved forward with quiet efficiency began to stall at odd points, not dramatically, just enough to be noticed. Questions that used to resolve themselves lingered. Decisions circled instead of landing. People started saying things like, "This feels more complicated than it used to," or, "We're spending a lot of time on things that were never an issue before." No one framed it as a problem yet. It was just friction. I watched it unfold without satisfaction or guilt. What I felt instead was confirmation. Not that I was indispensable, but that I had been compensating for gaps no one had owned. Meetings grew longer, agendas expanded. There were more follow-ups, more check-ins, more polite emails trying to align what used to align itself. Still, no one said my name. That was the strange part. The system was reacting to my absence in places where it had never acknowledged my presence. People felt the loss without knowing what they'd lost. A manager asked the group if anyone had insight into why a process had suddenly become unpredictable. Suggestions floated around, external pressures, shifting priorities, communication breakdowns, all plausible, not accurate. I said nothing. Not out of spite, but because stepping in too early would have restored the illusion. The illusion that these issues were random, rather than structural. The discomfort spread unevenly. Some people adapted. They slowed down, asked better questions, and took more responsibility. Others grew frustrated. They were used to things just working, and now they didn't. I noticed who leaned forward and who looked for someone to blame. One afternoon, a colleague stopped by my desk and asked if I'd noticed things feeling off lately. I said yes. She nodded, relieved, as if agreement itself was comfort. But she didn't ask for help. She assumed it would come when needed. It didn't. Not because I refused, but because I waited to be asked clearly. That difference mattered. Eventually, the questions came, though not directly. They came wrapped in concern, in tone shifts, in slightly longer pauses, when I didn't immediately fill the silence. People began to realize that something had changed, even if they couldn't articulate what. The consequences weren't loud, they were cumulative. And cumulative consequences are the hardest to reverse, because by the time you recognize them, they're no longer isolated incidents. They're patterns. Patterns force reckoning. I stayed steady through it all. No commentary, no explanations, just consistency. And consistency, when it's no longer compensating for imbalance, becomes a mirror. The system was finally seeing itself. Recognition arrived the way it often does, late, fragmented, and stripped of clarity. By the time people realized something fundamental had changed, they were already trying to fix the wrong thing. There were more meetings, more alignment sessions, new templates, new checklists, new language around ownership and process improvement. Leadership talked about efficiency as if it had recently gone missing, as if it were something that could be reinstalled with the right framework. What they couldn't see was that efficiency hadn't disappeared. It had simply stopped being subsidized. I watched from the same seat I'd always occupied, listening to conversations that circled the truth without landing on it. People spoke about capacity, about communication, about unexpected strain. No one spoke about the assumption. No one spoke about dependency. And no one spoke to me directly. That was the most telling part. Instead of asking who had been holding things together, they tried to recreate the effect without acknowledging the cause. They redistributed tasks without understanding the context. They accelerated timelines without resolving gaps. They asked for more output without addressing the structure that had quietly relied on one person's judgment, me. I could feel the tension in the room during those weeks. Not anger, uncertainty. The kind that makes people second-guess their instincts. The kind that reveals how much confidence had been borrowed, not built. At one point, a senior manager said, "We need to get back to how things used to run." I wrote that sentence down later. Because how things used to run wasn't a system, it was a person, and that person had changed. There were moments when I considered stepping in fully, explaining, rebuilding, restoring the old flow. It would have been easy, familiar. I knew exactly what to do. But doing so would have erased the only honest signal the system had ever received. So I didn't. Not because I wanted anyone to fail, but because I wanted the truth to stand on its own long enough to be recognized. By the time the right questions began forming, they were already framed by urgency. People wanted quick fixes, workarounds, something to stabilize the discomfort without examining its source. That's when I knew it was too late to go back. Not too late to improve, but too late to pretend nothing had changed. The old dynamic relied on my silence, my overextension, my willingness to absorb consequences no one else could see. Once that was gone, there was no seamless way to restore it without naming it. And naming it would require accountability from people who weren't prepared to offer it. I noticed subtle shifts in how I was addressed. More careful phrasing, more formal requests, fewer assumptions. Some of it felt like respect arriving belatedly. Some of it felt like uncertainty. But even then, no one asked the most important question. What do you need? They were still trying to manage the system around me rather than engage with me as a person inside it. That's the cost of delayed recognition. By the time it arrives, it's shaped by fear instead of understanding. I remained calm, present, professional. But the door back to who I used to be, the quiet stabilizer, the invisible buffer, was closed, not slammed. Closed with intention. Because once a system shows you that it only values your contribution when it's missing, you don't rush to restore it. You let it learn. The confrontation, when it finally came, didn't feel like a confrontation at all. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no dramatic unveiling of grievances. Just a meeting request was placed on my calendar with a neutral subject line and no agenda. I arrived on time, sat down, waited. 2 managers were there. Both professional, both careful. I could tell they had rehearsed. Not lines, but tone. The kind of tone people use when they sense something important has shifted, but they don't yet understand how. They started by saying they wanted to check in. Those things had felt more complex lately, that they valued my experience and wanted my perspective. I listened without nodding, without filling space. Eventually, one of them said, "It seems like a lot of things used to run more smoothly. We're trying to understand what changed." That was the opening, not an accusation, not an apology, just uncertainty. I answered simply, "I'm working within my defined role." Silence followed, not uncomfortable, revealing. They asked if I felt overloaded. I said no. They asked if I needed support. I said my workload was clear. The conversation kept circling, trying to locate a problem that could be fixed without being named. They wanted a lever they could pull without acknowledging the system that had relied on me beyond my scope. Finally, one of them asked carefully, "Is there something we should be aware of?" I paused, not for effect, but for accuracy. "Yes," I said. "For a long time, I was compensating for gaps that weren't formally owned. I'm not doing that anymore." That was it. No emotion, no history lesson, no blame. Just a statement of fact. The room changed, not dramatically, but distinctly. They didn't argue. They didn't deny it. They looked at each other briefly, then back at me. I could see the realization forming, not fully, but enough. They asked what I wanted. That question came too late to feel generous, but it mattered. "I want clarity," I said, "on responsibilities, on expectations, and on growth." There was no immediate resolution, no promise made in the room. But something irreversible had happened. The truth had been spoken calmly, and the calm truth is difficult to dismiss. The meeting ended politely. I returned to my desk and continued my day as usual. No adrenaline, no shaking hands. Just a steady sense that the dynamic had finally been named aloud. Not fought, named. And once something has a name, it can't hide an assumption anymore. Who I am now isn't louder than who I was before, just clearer. I still work quietly. I still value precision over performance. I still prefer substance to spectacle. But I no longer confuse silence with obligation or reliability with self-erasure. The role I occupy today is different, not because the organization transformed overnight, but because I did. My boundaries are visible now. My scope is defined. When I contribute, it's acknowledged not because I demand it, but because it's traceable. That distinction matters. I no longer absorb work that belongs to the system. I participate in shaping it. There's no bitterness in that, only accuracy. I learned that being respected isn't about being indispensable in secret. It's about being clear enough that your absence would require honest adjustment, not quiet expectation. People interact with me differently now. Some with more care, some with more distance. A few with a kind of recalibrated respect that arrives when assumptions no longer apply. And that's okay. Not everyone stays comfortable when the dynamic shifts. That discomfort isn't mine to manage anymore. What surprised me most was how much lighter I felt without changing my workload. The weight I'd been carrying wasn't effort. It was invisibility, the constant internal negotiation, the silent rewriting of my own limits. Letting that go didn't make me harder. It made me whole. I'm still the person people come to for clarity, but now it's requested, not assumed. I still solve problems, but only the ones I agree to own. I still work with care, but not at the cost of myself. And I don't explain that anymore. I've learned that explanation is often a substitute for boundaries. Once boundaries are clear, explanations become optional. There was a time when I thought my value came from how much I could endure without complaint. Now I understand that endurance without recognition is not strength, it's erosion. Strength is knowing when to be quiet and when silence no longer serves you. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't demand revenge or validation. I simply stopped shrinking. And in doing so, I found that respect doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it arrives with recalibration. And sometimes that's enough. There's a quiet myth many of us grow up believing that if we work hard enough, stay loyal enough, and ask for little enough, things will eventually balance out. That effort will be noticed, that patience will be rewarded, that respect arrives on its own schedule if we're good enough to wait. I believed that for a long time. What this experience taught me is that systems don't correct themselves out of gratitude. They adapt to whatever you consistently allow. If you reward assumption with silence, assumption becomes structure. If you reward overreach with compliance, overreach becomes normal. That doesn't make people cruel, it makes them human. Most of the harm in workplaces and in relationships isn't caused by intention, it's caused by convenience, by the quiet relief people feel when someone else absorbs the weight without asking questions. The lesson isn't to become louder, or colder, or more aggressive. The lesson is to become precise. Precision is what separates humility from erasure. It's what turns silence into choice instead of default. It's what allows you to give without disappearing. When loyalty is rewarded with more work and less respect, the answer isn't to withdraw care. It's to redirect it, toward yourself as well as others. To understand that being useful is not the same as being valued, and that shrinking to fit expectations only teaches people how little space you'll defend. The hardest part of this journey wasn't changing how others saw me. It was changing how I saw myself. I had to let go of the identity that felt safe, the one who never caused friction, never asked for more, never risked disappointment. I had to accept that some people preferred the smaller version of me, and that their preference didn't define my worth. Quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about self-respect practiced consistently, without spectacle. And once that practice begins, there's no need for revenge, or speeches, or dramatic exits. The system either adjusts or it doesn't, but you no longer shrink to keep it comfortable. That's the real reversal. So I'll leave you with one question, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. Where in your life are you being rewarded for loyalty with less respect? And what would change if your silence became a choice instead of a habit? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.